I'm ready to proceed with the disassembly and the rebuild of the Royal Blue number 350, but before I do, I've got to remove the side linkages. Now, part of the side linkages will remain affixed to the boiler. The side linkages are critical because they need to be separated prior to attempting to separate the chassis and the motor assembly from the boiler. I removed what side linkages I could, so now I'm ready to take the next step, and that would be to remove things that have to come off in order to get the chassis and the motor assembly out. One would be the jack panel. Sometimes, as you see below the jack panel, the separator bar has to be taken out, but not in this case. It's permanent on this particular locomotive. So I'll take the jack panel loose. I'm also going to remove the front pilot truck, get that off and out of the way because I'm going to need access to the lamp bracket and take it out as well because it's of course permanently attached to the motor assembly, and I don't need that to be attached to the boiler assembly when I'm trying to remove. Separated the jack panel from the boiler. I've got the back end of the motor assembly ready to be removed, and having unclipped the light bracket for the headlamp, I've got it ready as well. Next up will be removal of the two major motor mount or chassis mount screws here and here, and then I'll be able to slide it along the motor mount, which is right there, and probably remove the entire structure. Well, the chassis and the motor assembly and the reverse unit have all been removed. That was really easy once those two front motor or chassis assembly screws were removed. Slides right out. 350s are one of the easiest locomotives to disassemble and assemble. Even the sometimes problematic replacement or insertion of the reverse unit lock lever, getting it back in the slot and getting the motor positions can be problematic, but on these they seem to be a little more simple. So next up will be to take the reverse unit off, and I'll check my previous work on that. Looks like that I had replaced both fingerboards a long time ago. And then I'll work on the motor, take the field, armature, brush bracket assembly, everything out, check the brushes, probably replace them, and then I'll have the chassis and wheel and axle assembly separated, and we can go from there of pulling the wheel and cleaning that up. I've already noticed that shamefully it looks like I put in probably a little bit too much lubrication in the early days of when I was doing this. I wish I hadn't, and I probably used a very lightweight oil. So I'm probably going to give the chassis a very thorough washing and degreasing prior to reassembly, and I'm going to check, of course, the thrust, although this one has always had good thrust and good response. The only thing that I've noticed is it does have that little hum or buzz in the reverse unit. I'll see if there's anything I can do about that, but that's been the least of my problems with this train. With the separation of the boiler and the chassis assembly, you'll note that I was able to remove several of the linkages cleanly. The connecting rod and the side rod, this being the connecting rod, this being the side rod, can be removed, cleaned, polished, worked on, do whatever you need to do. I also separated the truck and front truck and strap assembly, so it too can be worked on. This would be a good time to replace the cone spring if you had to. Now, what stays on the boiler at this point is the valve link assembly, and it's imperative that it be protected. There they are. I don't know how many times I've seen or worked on these in which these were missing. Putting the rivets in is not impossible. It's not pleasant either, and I want to protect these valve link assemblies, so I'm going to set the boiler aside and probably let them rest inside the boiler so that there's less chance that they get snagged on anything. Now, once we get inside the brush and bracket assembly, which is right here, I'm going to show you a bushing that Mr. Barker mentions that could be problematic when attempting to center the armature inside the field, but we'll look at that in just a moment. But I want to go ahead and show something that I have begun to look at very closely in diesels and steamers, and that is the centering of the armature, or the centering of the field longitudinally. In other words, along the axis of the armature. This one seems to be very well centered. Notice that the endpoints or laminations seem to align. I've seen these in which the laminations were off maybe by 2 in either direction. And I usually try to improve that by the insertion in a diesel, for example, of new thrust plates, or in a steamer like this with thrust washers. Now, how I test it is simply to grab one of the driver wheels that's connected to the gear axle and just move it back and forth and seeing how much thrust there is. This one seems to be acceptable. Who knows, that may be why this train has such great performance. Actually, you can see right there in that area the top of that bushing. And if that thing is worn or missing, that means that the armature can move not only laterally along its axis, it can move within the orbit of the field and rattle, you might say, maybe even touch the field, which is undesirable. But we'll check all that once we get inside.